Hey there team, welcome back to the channel, welcome to the overview. Today we're reviewing Broken Arrow. That's just come out, about to come out. It's hard to keep track of all this advanced access stuff, right? If you pay a premium, you can play it a few days early. I think by the time this video goes up, it's going to be in normal release, so that should probably work out well. What do I think? I think this is really fun. I've had a really good time, but the framing and my perspective is probably important. I don't necessarily gravitate towards this genre. I don't even really know what to call it because it's a modern spin-off of what you would call the RTS of yesteryear. Very much like World in Conflict, or the big daddy is Steel Division, right? You've got other things out there, Warno, Regiments. I should go back and check Regiments out because I think that went more for a single player perspective. But generally speaking, in this genre, in this play space, it is dominated by a very rabid, sweaty multiplayer base. And that's not firing shots. I'm not having a go. There's nothing wrong with sweating your hobby. But generally speaking, a lot of the discourse and energy around this release, around these sort of games, is usually that side of the aisle, which personally, I don't have a lot of interest in. I really don't. I played a chunk of Steel Division 1 multiplayer, but that was because I was playing it with some army mates and we'd set it up like 3v3 versus AI and we'd all protect a flank each. And there's fun to be had there. But like I said, generally speaking, that's not the lens through which I look at it. I come from the, variety gamer, mainstream casual that likes a bit of everything. And I will say, if you've been craving things like Command and Conquer or StarCraft, these single player narrative heavy RTS type games, which are kind of few and far between these days, then you're kind of eating well here. I really enjoyed the campaign. I've finished the American one and I'm kind of halfway through the Russian one at the time of this video. If you're not across it, I put a ceiling on the time I spend with a game just because how long's a piece of string? Some games go for 500 hours and I want to get through everything succinctly in the week they come out if I can help it. See, I've put about 18 hours in and for most part that's just been campaign stuff. I have lost a couple of hours progress because there is no save state in the campaign missions, which befuddles me immensely. I can't understand why you wouldn't do that, and my sniffing around, this is a problem everyone's upset about and the developers are clearly trying to work on it. Now look, I don't presume to know how easy or hard it is to implement such a system, but you'd have to say, with some of these missions going for hours, I can't believe you could make such a poor oversight. I even remember things like the Kingdom Come Deliverance 1 save system debacle being kind of cruel, but it was there. It was a designer implementation that maybe misstepped. In here, it's just not there. And it makes you lose a little faith in a developer when they can potentially develop a game for 5 or 6 years and bleed for it and make it their life's work and achievement, and yet you can overlook such a fundamental important thing, and I don't know how that happens. And while I'm pointing out kind of critical issues with this game, setting up the skirmish mode to play with mates wasn't really implemented properly. It looks like it was all PvP only, and setting up a one versus the AI, which seems pretty obvious no-brainer, at least even to test out stuff. That wasn't there. They did patch that in within a day or so, which a lot of people will commend. I personally don't. I miss the days where games were released pre-internet and they couldn't be broken because you couldn't patch them. And funnily enough, 99% of games worked and didn't need a patch. It seems once you have this tool to fall back on, all of a sudden the rigor of a final product coming out in a working state falls away. But all of that aside, I still enjoyed my time. I clocked through the American campaign, half through the other campaign. You can sort of jump back and forth between the two. It's not campy corny like Command and Conquer, but the split factions, and they've got characters on each side, talking heads with narrative. They are a bit exaggerated, a bit camp, but it's not going for broke Command and Conquer style, but it's still scratches that itch, which I didn't know I had. I need to go back and look at Tempest Rising earlier from this year as well, because that's apparently the same. But yeah, it is fascinating that I enjoyed it, and there's a mix of nostalgia in there because it is something that we don't really get a lot these days. So yeah, it was a really fun experience, marred by some issues, and we'll talk about the game and the genre and all that in general. As far as my scoring system goes, it's dynamic, it's unusual. The idea is to review 100 games over the course of 12 months and kind of have it update as we review more games and cycle out all old games. But what you need to know is we're still populating the list, and it goes from 100 down to 1, and it's a straight ranking. So I'm placing this at 78%, which is to say underneath the first Berserker Kazan, which, for example, a perfectly functional, great game, actually, if a little forgettable for me personally, but, nothing really wrong with it to mar the experience, and above Worshippers of Cthulhu, and sitting on that line where that game was marred by issues, and this is a bit as well. So look, again, I struggle to put this in a genre name specific, and there might be a name amongst the fans for it, but I call it a Steel Division light. Though World in Conflict is the one that set the scene, and that's the one I remember most fondly, and honestly, this is the one that reminded me the most of it. Apart from Regiments, I spent a tiny bit of time with that, but I remember really liking that too. What's unique about this game is it's actually taking the dive that no one else seems to be brave enough to do for whatever reason, and going with modern conflict. Usually they pull the pin at the 70s or the 80s or World War II or what have you, but they just won't tackle modern machinery and warfare. So you might find all that interesting if you're a military enthusiast. My knowledge of, US and Russia and Baltic states type army forces, like a lot of this is set around Lithuania, and, Germany brings their tanks in at a certain point, and I don't know anything about any of this stuff. I recognize some things here and there, but it seems quite robust. The unit list, the deck list, which is a big part of these sort of games. You create your own custom deck to take them into multiplayer. There'll be a point balancing system. It's sort of like a Warhammer tabletop. That's my touchstone. I used to play tournaments for Warhammer. So like building a list against a point limit and different section limits, that's a big part of the multiplayer scene for these games. Again, this is, lowest common denominator in case you've never seen any of these before and you don't know what's going on. So you'll have like recon, infantry, vehicles, these subsections with limitations. From the campaign perspective, it is all very set piece and very well done at that. As in, you'll have your limitations. You could argue it's like fighting with a hand behind your back, but I think the development team's vision really shines through strongest when it comes to constructing these really unusual and varied scenarios. Sometimes it's frustrating, but for the most part, it's actually quite refreshing and fun. I did play like a press build early demo, and one of the missions that they put in there was like attacking an airfield and airdropping a lot of supplies, and I would probably argue that might have been the most boring, generic one of the lot. A pretty big open play space with a pretty unlimited deck for you to build from. So it's interesting that they use that to advertise the game when, some of the best scenarios in this were things like having to do this sort of river insertion through a humongous cityscape where one of the other armies was dragging off the enemy and distracting them while I escorted a bunch of like Delta operators in their little egg helicopters, those little baby ones, and you've got some Chinooks in there and Black Hawks and all, and doing this fast river speed insertion to get them up to get these documents, and then you get encircled and you're trying to airdrop stuff in without getting shot down, and it really did feel like Black Hawk Down the RTS for that level. That was really fun. And likewise, you got other ones where, it'll focus more on maybe helos. You got a helicopter-centric, protecting two different roads, trying to stop convoys breaking through, and so it's not so much that it's on rails, but it's pretty strict in its design, and that creates narrative interest and intrigue. So you've got this cast of characters which are memorable. You got your general, your major, who's sort of a bit more on your level. She's a pretty tough chick. The general's a nut, and I love him. He's bloodthirsty. Then you've got the government suit. What's his name? Miller or whatever. And they're all sort of butting heads and having interpersonal issues, but it's very entry level. It's light, right? There's enough there to keep you invested once you're already invested in the gameplay loop, which is king. So how does it actually play anyway? Well, generally speaking, you just have points in the top left corner, and up there is your kind of build menu. It's just a unit menu. This isn't your StarCrafts where you build Vespene geysers or anything like that. You literally just buy units from your deck, and they go against the point costs, and you pay for them, and you bring them in, right? And off they go fighting. And for the most part, attack, move, or hold sight lines. You can hold Alt to see what your area of effect is, or, your eye line. So you set up ambushes and crossroads, and the game really does reward you for getting into the rock, paper, scissors nature of a lot of engagements. Like if you set up a really good crossroads with rockets on a blind corner and that, every armored unit they send through is going to die, right? You're just going to obliterate them. So brute force only works to a certain point, which cuts the other way as well. Some scenarios can be really frustrating. You're told to break through or do that or whatever, and they don't convey super clearly what exactly it is that they want you to do from a designer level, and often throwing shit at the wall to see what dies and what doesn't work, and potentially even starting the scenario over can be the way through for some. And it's a little tragic and a little more obvious because when you do other scenarios that just really shine, and I guess my point is the imbalance is kind of exacerbated when you're playing a mission that's not as good as some of the real standout set pieces. Likewise, there'll be, and like on that, in your worst examples, there'll be scenarios where you are supposed to just fight a stalling retreat, right? You're just going to get smashed out of position, and it gets it's a little bit of a golden rule break, giving players agency and toys and then just smashing them with unfair numbers. And all of a sudden the enemy has mortars, that position's just obliterated. So all the dudes that you set up perfectly in that ambush, they're all dead now because the scenario demands it. So it goes, but my point is an enjoyable experience marred by its inconsistency. But yeah, anyway, you buy units into the scenario, and those units will be limited by what the scenario dictates. Like I said, there might be cases where I was doing this Russian mission where you had to go to like a fuel depot with helos and airlift out the supplies and retreat them off the board to increase your score to progress the scenario. So in that case, you don't actually have a spawn point for like land vehicles. You can get infantry in, but you'd have to helo drop them in. So sometimes you got to think a bit outside the box. But yeah, ultimately it's as simple as that. You buy your units, you send them in, you set them up in a building or a corner, or you can attack move them through areas, but you got to be careful doing that because the game very much does favor the set ambush, and that's a great way to win just about every engagement when the game lets you do it. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but yeah. Now, I alluded that there is rock, paper, scissors to it. It's not as obvious and explicit as some of the other games in the genre. So much so that I would say if this was your first time going into this, you might have a hard time, which is a little bit tragic because from, like I said, the perspective of a robust and interesting campaign that's very much single player focused and kind of the closest thing to the experience that I enjoy, which is, playing a COD single player campaign once a year and just enjoying my popcorn blasting AAA extravaganza for a first person shooter cinematic experience. This is kind of close for the RTS version of that. Like you have these built-in cutscenes that can only really be called military porn, where it's, panning cameras of planes doing flyovers and you just got this driving, thunderous soundtrack. It's very grunge, synth heavy, reminds me of all things of like the cyberpunk tracks that Health did for Cyberpunk 2077. So it really gets you in the mood, there's these intros, so it's dripping with style when it wants to be. But again, the other side of it is that there's no real encyclopedia or pop-ups. There are pop-ups at the beginning before you start, but even then they're vague. Like understanding how this game's systems work and what each and every unit does is really difficult to navigate, and this is someone who's played Steel Div and all that, so it's a tough recommendation to say have this be the first one of these if you're someone off the street, but at the same time, like, it's the one most catered to that single player armchair experience. And what I'm getting at is, if you mouse over a unit, it tells you all their armament, and again, it's not like a World War II game where everyone's got a bloody Kar-98 or something. It's modern military, adaptable, kind of Swiss Army knife squads for the most part, and you're playing different factions and sub-factions again. And so even your basic unit of Marines has like 4 or 5 different weapons in there. They've got rifles and grenade launchers and bloody rocket launchers, and it doesn't really tell you much about any of it. You'll mouse over it and it'll be like, this is an AGL-30 and you'll be sitting there going, what the fuck is that? Like, there is a lot of knowledge that comes from either being a sweat military, armchair asthmatic bookworm enthusiast, or someone that just plays it so much that you just learn through kind of osmosis. And that might really, I'm being cheeky about the sweats, but that might be exactly what they're looking for. But again, to reiterate, for a cinematic cutscene single player experience, it's not super compatible. They really needed like pop-ups and that, just explicitly explaining how units beat each other. And generally speaking, every unit seems to have hit points. They have an armor value. Like even infantry has like 5 armor, right? Whereas the bloody tank will have like 200 front, side, top armor. And it has very systems heavy ballistic. The damage numbers actually don't go that high. And I think, as best as I can understand it from my time with it, the idea is that the armor is the big dog and needs punching through in a lot of cases. And so you want to try and learn what's in your deck that has, well, like maybe you do have really powerful close range rocket launchers on infantry. So now you got to start thinking about how you're going to cut that pie. How do I get that tank on the open crossroads? How do I get close enough? And if you rush him, maybe you just rush him in a bloody Bushmaster or something like that, or a Lav or something like that. Just thunder up there, and when it blows up, out pop your dudes and shoot them. Maybe that's an option. You could try and helo drop in close, but then they might have air support, and while there is rock paper scissors to solving the problem, they become layered. So okay, well now there's these rocket launchers, maybe I need to do a different pincer attack to go and deal with the anti-air up the back to free it up so I can let my fast jets in or my helos. So look, it's intense. There's a lot of stuff there, and my main point is pulling all that apart is it's great having all these numbers and stats and fidelity. Again, if you're a military enthusiast, which ironically I'm not really that much for someone who actually had a military career, and most vets I speak to, at least from Australia, we see it as like you use a hammer for a nail, you get the right type of hammer. That's about as complicated as it gets for me. It's always a bit odd when people start nutting over particular guns and this, that, and the other, right? But each to their own. If that is you, then you'll probably really like this stuff, but it just doesn't really bridge that gap very well of explaining, well, this is for that, and this is what this weapon does. And I suppose in a way you're forced to learn the individual names and all that, but to put a bow on the long-winded point I've made, it's clearly targeted in a more mainstream, even casual friendly front end with its campaign, and yet once you start interacting with it, the enemy will potentially beat the living crap out of you because you just have a spreadsheet of numbers to look at, and the game doesn't really on-ramp you at all. And look, I'll briefly talk on the multiplayer thing. I didn't jump into multiplayer. I jumped into skirmish mode to have a look. Again, the issues with this launch befuddle me, and it goes a little bit deeper without, losing the plot too much. I don't really understand the industry-wide almost aversion to just launching your product feature complete. Like, as a rule, and you might have noticed because I'm reviewing games now, I'm limiting how much time I spend with each game because I'm just sick of broken mess games, to the point where, like, yeah, something like early access might excite me, but I now hold to the idea that, fuck it, I'll play it in 2 years when it gets to 1.0. Let's make sure it's not a scam. It costs me nothing to just wait. But then you have, examples here. These are some pretty critical problems. Like I said, the save state thing still at the time of this video hasn't been resolved, and that's going to be a no-buy for a lot of the people that would be the target audience, right? Old boys, 40 plus years old with 3.5 kids, a mortgage, and a screaming wife. You're just going to want to kick back for your 30 minutes of free time to play your military exciting game with, rockets and helicopters and whoosh, and all this sort of crap, and you're going to stop halfway through a mission because life calls and it won't let you save state. Like, I really think it's such a terrible oversight. I don't know how you get that wrong. But on the multiplayer side, they're having all sorts of issues over there as well. Like, from what I understand, you can only lobby fight. There's no real ranked queue system, and yet there's an elo system implemented, which is a bit strange. So again, this is a bit secondhand, but just briefly going through some of the discussion around it, people rightly pointed out there's not really anything to filter going in as an absolute newbie that just wants to learn the ropes, coming up against a 10 billion hour steel div sweat stomping the living crap out of them. So it's still got issues. And then on top of that, like I said, it didn't really have options to verse the AI at launch properly, and they hurriedly patched it so you can set up, 1v1s, 2v2s and that sort of stuff. But again, a lot of this stuff is criminally overlooked, and I don't think the excuse of this game having outsized mainstream uptake being really reasonable, because it is, like, it's fairly high profile, unusually so for a game like this. But you would still think, even if you're making your niche indie game, you make it as well as you can, and you try not to leave problems out and implement all the systems that would be expected. And anyway, yeah, it just boggles me. So look, for my part, I'm informing you that these critical things still aren't implemented at the time of review, and they should count against it, because that at the very least tells you what sort of studio doesn't implement something like that, doesn't push the date or in order to implement it, or, at the other end, they didn't even think that a save system would be important. I'm just using that as an example, but there are a few other issues, Anyway, look, this is my review of Broken Arrow. I did enjoy my time with it, and it is actually a really good example of my time with it was marred by the negatives, that it's negatively affected my enjoyment. So each to their own. Maybe leave it for a while and see if they sort this shit out and fix this. Maybe you can overlook some more stuff, but and look, just to leave you with this final example, the last mission that I was playing before I stopped to do this video was the one with kilos where I had to pick up fuel and bring it back. And the game and some of the narrative from the chick talking in your ear was, there's fast jets coming over and our jets will protect you from their jets, but they're all going back to refuel. When they come back, you'll be in trouble. So there was this grey area, but there's no timer or anything explicit. But, they inferred that maybe I would run out of time. So I just kept going along, because the other missions had timers with fail conditions. This one didn't. And then, at this hidden timer, which was not telegraphed anywhere on the screen, they said, oh, no, their jets are back and you failed. And I'm pretty sure I spent over an hour on that mission because I got into a pretty slow, meticulous system that was working. So like that sort of inconsistency, and that really does frustrate with me, and I don't want to get emotional and yelling and screaming. I try and keep composure, but that does really frustrate me when I can list off, half a dozen problems off the top of my head with this release. Anyway, like I said, a great game if you can get through all the mess. If you are someone that isn't really part of that multiplayer fandom, but you're interested in things that harken back to, like, Command and Conquer and StarCraft, Warcraft, narrative, pretty accessible, mainstream, dare I say, RTS campaigns, then there's something really cool here with some really interesting scenarios and fun mechanics and a game system built on complex systems that just doesn't explain itself very well, sadly. Anyway, let me know what you reckon. Might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.